Hi everybody, and welcome to the 2021 version of the Cult Film Conference at KURJA POLT. As you know, we've gone online this year, and over the course of the last week, we've been putting a talk up each day from our speakers, and I'll introduce the speakers in a moment. And what we're going to do today basically is unpick a little bit some of the ideas, some of the things they talked about, and just expand upon them a little bit and see where we get to. So I'd just very briefly like to introduce our speakers. We've got Dr. 𝘆𝗵𝗿𝗀𝗀 from the University of Hertfordshire, Dr. cie𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀 from the University of Hertfordshire, Dr. Steve Jones and Dr. Johnny Walker from Northumbria, and Dr. 𝗹𝗲𝗰𝗁𝗂 from RMIT in Melbourne. Hi everyone. Right, let's start off first of all with Laura and Shelley. So you talked about video and the kind of place that video and dead media to a certain extent have within the modern horror film. I just wondered if you could tell us what it is about video that particularly seems to appeal. Why is video being used? What is it about that as a medium?
Well, I think it's a number of things. I think first of all, video is just one form of media. It's just one format that we're looking at. Some of the other things that we're looking at in this project, which we're right at the beginning of, by the way, so it's still very early days. We're also looking at the way that TV is used in horror media, and the way that vinyl or old film formats are used. So we're doing some other work on films like Sinister at the minute, which are looking at 8mm. I think for video, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, there's that analog aesthetic which we kind of addressed in the talk, which kind of adds to the eeriness, I think, of kind of suggestions of hauntings that come across through static and through glitch and through tracking lines and things like that. I also think there's obviously a particular video culture around horror in terms of collecting and collectors, which I know other people on this panel have looked at, and obviously we look at very, very briefly, and we want to look at more detail as we go forward. And I also think it kind of connects to a wider trend of 1980s nostalgia that we're getting at the minute in not just in horror cinema or horror media, but across genres and across different areas. I think there's a lot of love for the 1980s, both in terms of its themes and its objects as well as its aesthetics. So I think there's that's for me would be the kind of key things. I don't know if Shelley has anything additional that I've missed.
I was just going to say about like the age of creators. So like I remember, I was born in 1984, showing my age, but I remember going to video stores and that whole kind of aesthetic of the box art and the kind of shelves full of videos and the way videos looked when you had them for too long and they went all fuzzy and the colour drained out of them. And I think a lot of horror creators at the moment are kind of my age or older and have come into sort of creating horror films at this time. So you're getting a lot of people who have those experiences of VHS making horror now. So that's probably part of it as well, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely something generational or cyclical to it, I think. So
I was just going to, sorry to interrupt, I was just going to say, it's one of the things that struck me, for instance, I looked at the directors of VHS, for instance, and, they're all in their 40s now, probably in their sort of late 30s, early 40s when that film was made. And you do wonder if that's a kind of generation looking back. Do you think that nostalgia is the key driver, or is there something else there, do you think, as to why video is being used?
That's a good question. I certainly think it's one of the key drivers. I think Shelley's right. This is a format that people grew up with, that horror fans who are now horror filmmakers would have grown up with and would have engaged with it, as teens probably, or even younger. So a lot of our introductions to horror, slightly older than Shelley, but only by a bit. And my introduction to horror was all VHS, video shops, older brothers introducing me to stuff that they shouldn't have done when I was far too young, that kind of thing. And I think it's got that kind of nostalgic attachment to it, I guess. And it's something that attaches to an object as well. So it's quite an easy kind of identifiable form of nostalgia, when you can attach something not just to a film, but also the medium that you watched it on and the way that you engaged with it, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and there's something about like the way video looks. It is just, for me, spookier. if something's on video, it's kind of looks spookier and scarier and more illicit than something on crystal clear DVD.
What is it that for you then, Shirley, that makes it more kind of illicit? Is it the experience? Does it go back to that experience of watching maybe as a child? What is it exactly?
I think partly, I mean, my introduction to horror was I was 5 or 6 years old and my older brother rented Evil Dead. And I was desperate to get into the room and watch it, but I wasn't allowed to watch it. And in the end, my brother was so annoyed with me just hanging out just outside the door that he pulled me into the room and sat on me and was like, watch it then, you really want to watch it, watch it. So I think part of it for me is that. And I think there's something, especially when VHS starts to degrade, there's something like, I don't know, I can't articulate it, but there's something about that look of like degraded, rubbish, staticky VHS that is, it feels like you're not meant to be watching it. It feels like you found it somewhere, and there's something creepy about it, something illicit about it that for me is part of that aesthetic of 80s horror, because the way I watched 80s horror when I was a kid was on these super pirated duplicate of a duplicate VHSs.
Yeah, and I think there's a quote that we use in the presentation. Is it 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗃 who says about like the VHS aesthetic is it kind of lends to like the illicitness of a film. It kind of adds to this idea that we perhaps shouldn't be watching what we're watching, that this isn't made for us, that we're not supposed to be seeing it. So it adds some kind of air of the unknown, I guess, as well to what you're watching. Yeah.
Are any of the filmmakers who are using video in this way actually maybe not children of the 80s, maybe people who wouldn't have experienced video? Is there some element to it as well that might be a sort of curiosity with an object that they didn't quite engage with?
Offhand, I can't think of anyone that's kind of in their 20s. There probably is people that are doing that are in their 20s, but we were well, Laura was rewatching Sinister 2 last night, and we were having this conversation about that film and why would the kids in it, who are like 10 in the 2010s, know what Super 8 film is. And I think there is, like, with students that I teach, there is kind of a weird curiosity about VHS that they don't quite get it. But if you look at Instagram, you know, you've got the VHS filters that you can put on your pictures. I think there are younger people definitely like the aesthetic and are interested in that aesthetic. So I think it's something that's going to continue on for a while after everyone in their 30s kind of ages up.
Ages up and starts making films about DVD.
Well, that was my sort of next question really was, do you think the same kind of thing could, I mean, it's difficult to answer these kind of questions, but is it something you could see happening with DVD and digital?
I think possibly, yeah. I think maybe it obviously in a very, very different in terms of its kind of aesthetic sense. But you know, just the same as in the 80s and 70s and 80s, we saw sort of haunted media on television. So we kind of, when we've looked at the context for this project, we've thought about things like Poltergeist or Videodrome, that kind of thing. And then obviously kind of as you move forward and those forms of media become outdated, and then, you know, more and more text engage with them as kind of objects of the past. So yeah, I could definitely see that happening. And I mean, media in horror has quite often engaged with media as kind of a changing. So the fear of change and the fear of newness and the fear of new technologies and the kind of threats that they potentially pose. So, you know, around the turn of the millennium, lots of films about like the threat of the internet, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think as time goes past, we start looking backwards rather than kind of looking at the present moment or looking forward a few years and seeing what could go wrong with things. We're kind of looking back and thinking about haunting.
Great. Okay, I'd like to move on to talking to Alexia now. Alexia, a very sort of maybe a simple question, maybe not, but why this visibility now for this post-punk scene in Melbourne? Why is it at this moment in time? Is that to do with nostalgia as well?
Yeah, I reckon it does have something to do with nostalgia. And I'm not sure, you know, like I have mixed feelings about that nostalgia. I guess there's different types of nostalgia, or nostalgia has different potential functions, right? So in some ways it's great, because, you know, there was a lot of important stuff that happened in the music scene and the art scene more broadly in Melbourne in particular at the time that my presentation is about. And, you know, it's the kind of scene that you would hear referred to, you know, like someone like 𝘵𝗵𝗲𝗿 would talk about how great these Melbourne bands are, or, you know, like people around the world who are much more famous had this as a reference point, but Australians didn't necessarily have it as a reference point. So it's great in that way. But there is something also about the kind of the aesthetic level being kind of scooped up sort of unthinkingly that's a bit like, if you're a fan of the music, it can be a little bit like a bit offensive or something, or disappointing or something. So yeah, I think it is nostalgia, and I definitely see it connected to this kind of nostalgia boom. But I suppose the films that I looked at in my presentation were all made at different times. So I think they probably have different functions in relation to recuperating the moment.
I mean, based on that, how do you feel that that nostalgic look back has changed then, based on the fact these films are kind of made at different points? Have you seen a kind of pattern of change in how people have looked back?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Dogs in Space, which is the first film that I talk about in the presentation, is interesting as an act of memorialization because it's made not very long after the moment that it's about. So it doesn't have that kind of substantive time in between. And so it's got this kind of, I mean, it has a really mixed reputation, by the way, in Australia. Lots of people really don't like this film, including people who were part of the scene, because it was like a little bit too soon or something. And it references very specific figures, not using their real name or whatever, but, you know, so it has this kind of weird relationship to the actual moment because of its closeness, I suppose. But at the same time, it's sort of like, I think the point of it was to try to hold on to this very ephemeral kind of culture that was about to disappear, or people felt was kind of disappearing. And I mean, it was disappearing in the sense that it was moving overseas. This is what Australians do in order to become noticed, I suppose. You have to leave, basically. Not that you can now, so now there'll be more nostalgia about being able to leave. So I think that film has a different relationship to that kind of memorialization or recuperating that history than, say, Donna McRae's film Johnny Ghost, so the one I discuss more towards the end of the presentation, which is more about the kind of haunting quality of the scene and the way that this moment kind of haunts people. But I think that's also a very interesting, not a straight nostalgic take. I think it's trying to do something more complicated and kind of more important. And that's probably because Donna was part of that scene. So she has this kind of firsthand experience of what that moment was and what it was like, and what was great about it, but what was also really problematic. Lots of people died, lots of drugs, things like that. So I think that her take is kind of interesting and not that sort of straight nostalgia. But generally, you know, like a university here just gave Nick Cave an honorary doctorate. Like, he was this kind of post-punk figure that, you know, had to leave to be noticed, and now he's like, you know, hero, Australian hero. So there is that kind of stuff happening as well at the more mainstream level. I think the films are doing something slightly more interesting than what's happening at that kind of very mainstream level.
I mean, just in terms of the films, how widespread is that look at the post-punk scene? Is it limited to a kind of narrow, is it niche and limited to a narrow number of films, or is it something that actually pervades Australian culture and film a bit more than we might expect?
There's kind of a little bit more than those films. So they're not the only kind of 3 films by any means, but there's quite a few documentaries made about the period, a number of them made by Richard Lowenstein, who made Dogs in Space. So he's kind of returned to that period a number of times and made documentaries around particular figures. He also made a documentary about making Dogs in Space, which is kind of, yeah, super reflexive, like really interesting. So there's kind of a body of work. There's also quite a bit of writing. There's photography. So there's sort of this recuperation and memorialization of the moment through the work of particular photographers like Peter Milne. So there's kind of a set of various arts practices, and cinema kind of is part of that. But yeah, it's not only a film thing.
The Dogs in Space film you talked about, you said that's got quite a mixed reception. Is that quite a kind of cult film then in Australia?
Yeah, I guess in the kind of most straightforward sense, it's a cult film. I mean, when it came out, from memory, most people were like, you know, what the hell is this? Like, it had quite a big budget for an Australian film at the time, and I can't remember the budget exactly, but you know, it has this meandering storyline that doesn't really go anywhere. Nothing, you know, things just happen and there's no resolution or even particular kind of conflict or whatever. So I think a lot of Australians were kind of disappointed with it as like our, you know, the film that we made that year or whatever. And it also stars Michael Hutchence, the singer from INXS, who was becoming really famous at that point. So it had a lot more attention than it otherwise might have. And then a lot of people who were part of the scene were also unhappy with it and how it portrayed the scene. So it was kind of this poison chalice sort of film. But it is being reassessed now. So it's kind of being thought about as this quite important document now, which is great to see. So I think it's kind of its status and its value has changed over time, which I guess is part of that nostalgic kind of recuperation.
I mean, just sort of finally on that, the Johnny Ghost film that you talk about, have films like that, or has that film forced a kind of reassessment then? So you say that Donna's sort of trying to challenge in many ways some of the ways in which that nostalgia has functioned. Has that film challenged the way people have thought about the post-punk scene?
I think so. I mean, it was, you know, it's an independent film. Her subsequent films have had a larger audience than that one, so it's not a, you know, a particularly widely seen film, although it's quite well awarded. So I'm not sure. I think some stuff has been written about that film in terms of the way it deals with women in particular. So one thing that did happen through this moment is that through this kind of memorialization of this moment, is that the same key figures get kind of held up, and that's Nick Cave and Roland S. Howard, and it's mostly men, right? It's mostly white men. And the women were a huge part of it. There were heaps of female musicians, artists, you know, they were a really active part of the scene. So I think that film kind of does something important at that level. But it needs to be written about more widely, I think, and it needs to be, spoken about more widely.
Great, thank you, Alexia. Steve, so Steve, you talked about the meta-modern slasher, this sort of moment in the sort of early 2000s onwards where the slasher film appears to change. I just wondered why at that moment in time you felt that, why did it happen at that time? Why that change then? It struck me from what you said in terms of just the sensibility of those films, that maybe there is a sort of just a generational change from the sort of, you know, Gen X to the millennials, actually, in terms of this. You talked, I think, about the idea that previously slasher films had kind of been a bit, well, you know, we can't really change very much and nothing can really happen. And then you get this shift to, look, actually, there can be change, things can be different, which strikes me as almost a change between sort of Gen Xers and millennials in many ways. I just wondered why you felt that in that moment in time, the meta-modern slasher begins and is sort of flourishing now.
I think there's a number of things coming together at the same time. One of them definitely is the generational shift. So there's been a shift in it's what I'm calling a shift in the zeitgeist. It's caused a shift in tone, but really it's a shift in the zeitgeist because that particular type of culture is aimed at young people. So it's and it's made by younger filmmakers. So it's capturing a particular worldview at that point in time. It's also that I think we're far enough away from the kind of nihilistic, inward-facing culture of the 90s, which is more widespread than just the slasher films. I'm talking about grunge culture and a wider cynicism around politics at the time and so forth. There's something about that particular moment that was quite inward-facing and defeatist in some ways. So now we've got enough distance away from that. There's room for a generational shift, and the generational shift is not exactly diverging completely away from it, but it's certainly building on what came before in a distinctive way. There's also, I think in some respects, it's a response to the way that horror is being treated in the critical press at the time. So at that particular moment, there's a kind of split where horror seen as being dried up and dead because there's this understanding that there was no decent horror in the 90s, even though there was patently loads of good horror in the 90s, as the postmodern slasher period demonstrates. But then we move into a period that's defined either by kind of jokey trash horror or torture porn, which is perceived erroneously to be entirely humorless and has this sort of deadened quality. So somewhere in the midst of that mess, we get this reaction against that as well, which is most of the meta-modern slashers tend to be fairly light-hearted in some respects, that ties hand in hand with their optimism, or sincere in a way that isn't sort of pessimistic in the ways that some of the more torture porny sort of films seems to be.
I wonder, given the sort of length of time that the subgenres existed, is there any sense of, we've talked about nostalgia quite a lot here, is there a sense of nostalgia that is linked somehow to this meta-modern slasher?
It's the meta-modern slasher has a quite a complex relationship with the past, I think, and as well as the future. What I regret now picking the examples that I did, given the other papers and the way they've juxtaposed, because I've got a chapter in the book about nostalgia, which actually would have been better suited to tie in with what everyone else is saying. What the meta-modern slasher seems to be doing is that it's working again against the context of remakes, which are trying to bring the past into the present or align the past with the present in some respects, and throwbacks as well. There's a lot of slasher throwbacks that are trying to capture what the formulaic 80s slasher films were like in some respects. The meta-modern slasher is doing something slightly different in the sense that it's working as a bridge between the past and the future. So there's a distinct focus on the present within these films, but it's always as a linking point between the past and the future. So it's always forward facing, but it's also very aware of its own past and evokes the past as a means of getting to the future, which is slightly different to some of the throwback slashers I mentioned, like Trackman, that are just trying to either recapture the magic of the past by evoking the past, like with its aesthetics, or is just trying to replicate the past as a kind of return to the authentic or something. And the meta-modern slashers aren't really interested in doing that in that way.
I mean, this might be quite an unfair question to some extent, but do you think, from what you've said, it sounds like there are a kind of bridge to something else that might come next? I'm just wondering if you have any sense of where you anticipate the genre might go, because I think from what comes out of your talk and the description was, it sounds like these are more positive about the future of the subgenre, and they're positive about saying we can do different things, and they start to do different things, but it feels then like a sort of beginning that might go somewhere else. And I just wondered if you had any sense, any feeling from particularly from recent films that you've seen in the subgenre, where you think it might go.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the difficulty of it, because I think that in the same way that when you get the 90s films and they're kind of just burrowing in saying there's no possibility of originality, so here it is, there's no point in trying, so it becomes quite apathetic and jokey about itself. The danger of having a moment in the subgenre where it's future facing is saying, well, we can change to some extent, is that the only way forward is to change to such an extent that you change the subgenre. So I suspect we'll see the same kind of thing coming out of this eventually that we saw with torture porn being a new version of the slasher film, because effectively it borrows a lot from the slasher film, but creates something that's distinctive enough that it isn't quite the same subgenre. I think that's what we'll see coming out of the meta-modern slasher film, is something that isn't identifiably a slasher film anymore, and it's become something different. That's aside from a new generational shift that will change the tone and the aesthetic in some way. That's where I see it going.
I mean, sort of linked to that, I wonder, it's a bit of a general question, but what do you see as the continuing appeal of the slasher? Why has it lasted so long and metamorphosized in all these different ways?
I think the key strength of the slasher film, and this was identified really early on by critics like 𝗵𝗲𝗍𝗀, for instance, is that it's got such a clear and robust structure. It's got a clearly defined set of tropes that distilled very quickly into something uniquely identifiable and easily replicable, but that gives it enough scope that it can shift in different ways but still be recognizable as a slasher film. And that's what I think gives it its power and its sustainability. Is there's so much you can do within a simple structure, and that's what critics didn't really understand, is that they saw the simple structure as being one-dimensional trash rubbish, whereas actually I think that's its key strength, is this, it becomes malleable because there's something sustaining in the middle of it that's easily accessible.
Great, thank you, Steve. Johnny, I'd like to come to you next. I just want sort of, again, a kind of general question to start with, really, which is, do you think that horror is particularly well suited as a genre to activism? Is there something about the horror film that means actually it lends itself really well to activism?
It's a good question, and I'm going to give you a rather cliched response. But I think that because horror, you know, thematically, there's so much there, it can be quite a confrontational genre. I think, you know, given that activism is confrontational in and of itself, I think that, I mean, the short answer is yes, you know, because horror, so the story goes, is there to shock, and therefore, you know, it provides a platform whereby ideas can be presented that can challenge an individual's worldview. I think to make it activism, though, it has to be something else. You know, it can't just be the film in and of itself. It has to be something else. There has to be some additional contextual factors, various contexts within which the film is shown, who's present to present the film, that makes it activist. It can't just be a sort of a social document that probes specific areas, because I mean, horror films have done that, you know, since the king died, as it were. So yeah, I think horror film lends itself to activism, but it can't just be the film itself is not the only component, I would say.
Can I just unpick that a bit more, though, and just think about what it is specifically, though, about horror that makes it useful here? And I'm wondering, what I'm getting at to some extent is there a certain kind of activism that it lends itself to? So obviously your talk was about vegan activism, and it would seem that horror, obviously, given the subject matter, lends itself really well there. Are there other forms of activism, or is it limited to a certain kind of activism?
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, the one thing about, I mean, because you know, the talk that I was given is about, you know, one specific example. And Melanie Light, the filmmaker, I think is fairly unique insofar as that, to my knowledge, she's the only person who has treated her film as a piece of activism, insofar as that she's it's been incorporated into broader campaigns. It's been presented in environments where activists are present. It's been featured on, you know, the websites of various animal rights charities and whatnot. So like, that's not to say that the idea of an activist horror film couldn't be easily applied to another, you know, another cause, as it were. It just, to my knowledge, has not happened yet. But that's not to say that it couldn't, and that it shouldn't. And I should also say that, you know, the Herd, even though it's about vegan feminism, you know, it's also about feminism, generally speaking. It just so happens that, you know, the strand of feminism that it's exploring is the widely contentious notion that, you know, the experience of factory farmed animals in some way, you know, mimics the experiences of human beings. If we think about, you know, physical and sexual abuse, mistreatment, social hierarchies, etc. You know, these are all ideas that aren't new ideas. Like, you know, it's not just, you know, I'm just not little Johnny Walker, white man, saying all this stuff. You know, this, you know, there's a long history of vegan feminist philosophy that would support this notion. But yeah, so the Herd's about more than the sum of its parts, I think.
I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more then about the Herd, actually, in relation to activism and its sort of journey. You talked about its journey in festivals. How important do you think the festival circuit is to it? Because clearly that's something where the filmmaker can speak to an audience directly. Are those kind of things important with this kind of film in particular?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the festival circuit was hugely beneficial to the 𝘆𝗲𝗿'𝗀's journey. For the reasons that you outline. I mean, Melanie Light was able, and indeed the screenwriter 𝗹𝗲𝗰𝗁 was able to be there, as is often the case at festivals, as we all know, to present it as what it is. It wasn't, this is a film that could be interpreted in numerous ways. This is a film that is designed to make you think about X, Y, and Z. It was promoted as, within the festival context, as a vegan feminist horror film. Now, that could potentially be very alienating. People may not, upon learning that a film has an agenda to change your mind, that might switch people off. But then I think that's part of the reason why the film is so significant is that its purpose is always front and center. Peter Hutchings, because I've just been doing this Hammer and Beyond book, and Peter Hutchings in Hammer and Beyond talks about films that are socially purposive often being veiled or coded, and you have to sort of dig to find what the film is saying about a particular historical period or whatnot. With the 𝘆𝗲𝗿𝗀, it's not that. And directorial intent and all that stuff is front and center to the message of the film, and indeed how it's supposed to be received. There is no ambiguity or intended room for interpretation beyond the surface level message, which is essentially everybody should go vegan.
Well, on that note, I think we'll open it up to questions from everybody. So I just want to see if anyone's really got any questions for any of the other speakers.
I've got a quick question for Johnny, if that's all right. And
Sure.
It's about the funding of the 𝘆𝗲𝗿𝗀, because this is something I know of the film, but I don't know about that. Because and I only thought of this, I'm sorry, I know we've had loads of conversations about the 𝘆𝗲𝗿𝗀 in the past, but I've only thought of this when I was watching your paper, that one of the things that distinguishes the 𝘆𝗲𝗿𝗀 from other activist horror films that I know about is that, you're talking about it being a short film. I think really helps that it can go on websites, that it's done the festival circuit with Melanie Light touring it. Whereas the other activist horror films that I know about, like The Life Zone, which is an anti-abortion film, or Lock-In, which is a Christian-funded anti-masturbation, anti-online porn film, those are all framed as activist horror films. They've got a specific agenda. They're out there. But what distinguishes them is they're funded by organizations that are trying to promote that activist cause. So The Life Zone was funded by Justice for All, for instance. So I'm wondering what's the funding structure of the 𝘆𝗲𝗿𝗀? Was it supported by Peter or anyone like that?
No, that's a really, really, really good question, actually. It was crowdfunded through Kickstarter. As seems to be the case with a lot of films these days, anyway. But the campaign, the funding campaign for the film, like the videos, the pitch video that the filmmakers made to say to potential funders, you should fund this for these reasons. I mean, it was directly addressed to vegans, essentially, vegan horror fans. So in the sense that it wasn't funded by a charity or another organization with sort of a vested interest in this stuff. The campaign video certainly reached out to individuals who are sympathetic to the plight of non-human animals, but also indeed the plight of the filmmakers to make a film about this particular issue. And it was $5,000. And also, the point that you make about the short film, I think, is also significant as well. Because it's more digestible. It can pack a punch in like any campaign video, really. So yeah, Kickstarter. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Johnny. Steve, any other questions?
I've got a question for Steve, actually. thanks everyone for your presentations. They were all great, by the way. Steve, I was just interested because you were using the teen film as this kind of, you know, the teen film kind of happens alongside these other genres, right, which are kind of connected to the teen film and whatever. And I've been teaching teen movies at my university recently, and we kind of do it chronologically, and we get to this point where I think the angst like disappears, like there's no more angst anymore, right? Yeah. And the students like love it when we get to that point, because they're like, oh, this is better because like it, you know, it feels better, it's nicer, like it's a bit more focused or whatever. And I'm like, but where's the teen angst experience, right? And I was wondering if you felt that with that meta modern kind of slasher film, and that just that clip that you showed where there was that mourning of the dead, if you feel that that's introduced some kind of more didactic element into this strain, where it's like it's telling you more how to feel about the stuff, whereas with like the earlier slasher movies, you weren't instructed as much, I feel, with how to feel.
Yeah, I think in the earlier slasher films there just wasn't much space for feeling, really, apart from that angsty sort of thing. But that was then thrust into the plot, like the paranoia and trying to work out who's after you or why they're after you. Whereas I think that as we've become as the generation has become more alive to mental health issues and so forth, I think that's where that thrust towards that sort of sincere emotional response comes from. I'm not sure that I would call it didactic so much as just trying to reflect something about the way, because we're in an odd cultural moment where I think young people are more willing to express their emotions than ever before, but at the same time we're still living with the fallout of the 90s and that sort of irony, so there's a kind of protective layer to it. I think in some ways some of these films strip that back slightly, like Getting Schooled is one of those films that strips it back and just gives you the emotion. I think you can still read it ironically in the sense that it's not the best acted film in the universe and so forth. I think it gives you space to read it in that way, but it's trying to do something sincere, whereas other films of this kind are using irony as a way of promoting the sincere message. Like, oddly, one of the sort of proto meta-modern films is Terra Firma. So it's got like, even though it's absolutely absurd, it's so over the top and it's like a circus at times. It's got this really sincere underpinning that I think speaks to a newer generation rather than an older one. It's not angsty about the fact that there's crisis everywhere so much as it's just embracing the fact that we're in crisis and saying someone needs to do something about it. I don't know what we do yet, but here it is. And I think that's probably what speaks to the younger generation there.
Thanks, Steve. Any other questions?
I've got a question for Steve that I think bounces quite well off of that question. Growing up with like the postmodern slashers, one of the character types that I hated was like the Randy from Scream character, because he's just obnoxious. Yeah. And I was thinking when during your talk about the Getting Schooled film and how it kind of takes these stock characters but then gives them more and kind of like rounds them out a little bit. And I wondered if in meta modern slasher films there is an equivalent character to the Randy know-it-all character, or is he just, we're just going to leave him in the 90s where he belongs?
Actually, there are some really interesting examples of playing with that character type. So there's a film called You Must Be the Killer, which has a direct equivalent to Randy. So the film is set around this, it's specifically an anti-90s movie, I think, in some ways, that it's in the title, you know what's going to happen, which is the lead protagonist is the killer. You find that out, he realizes that 15 minutes in that he's the killer, and he just spends the rest of the film trying to stop himself from killing the other characters. But he's got the sort of Randy equivalent, is his best friend who works in a comic book store, and he rings her up and she's constantly talking in film references, going, oh, we've seen these films millions of times, you know what to do. And everything she advises is useless to him and actually makes the situation worse. And it's not really labored in that way, but that's one of the ways that it handles that sort of Randy character, is to say the advice that Randy offered in the first place was useless, in the same way that you know, he's constantly harping on about virgins surviving, but most of the people who survive at the end of the screen isn't specifically on virgins, like Sydney's dad, for instance, who clearly isn't a virgin. It plays with it in those kinds of ways, but most of it ends up either debunking the Randy character in that sort of subtle way, or has them killed off really early on because they proclaim to know things, but then their knowledge is useless to them in the real world situation. I agree. I think he's annoying.
Steve, any other questions?
I've got questions for everybody. Oh, sorry, Johnny.
That's
Johnny
okay.
was really polite and put his hand up, and I'm just like, I'll ask every question.
I did precisely what Russ told me not to do. I'm sorry.
For which reason, Laura, your question?
Well, I had one for Steve, but I think it's been covered really nicely. One of the things that struck me in your comparison of the postmodern slasher and the metamodern slasher was this kind of cynicism in the 90s and the early 2000s, and particularly the callousness in that morning scene in the classroom in Cherry Falls. It's just like I don't really have any recollection of watching these films as a, you know, in my late teens and my early 20s and thinking that these guys were arseholes and that everybody was horrible. But then watching those clips back and thinking back about those films, it really did strike me. But I think like Alexia picked that up, and you've tackled that really well. So I'll skip over it. I was gonna ask Alexia about the use of archival footage in Johnny Ghost. I think one of the things I thought was really fascinating about your presentation was that the clips that you used, the first two that you give that really detailed, excellent analysis of, are using kind of very mediated ideas of people's memories and pastness. So you know, the first clip you use is obviously, you know, somebody's kind of death dream sequence on, you know, in the process of them dying. And then you get that clip in the club, in the second clip that you use, where the sound is kind of removed, and you talk about us being kept at kind of, our memories being kept at kind of arm's length because we're not privy to kind of sound, the combination of sound and image. And what I thought was really interesting then is that comparison with Johnny Ghost, where you've got the scene where is it Millicent? Sorry, was it Millicent? Have I written that down wrong? Who walks past the club and hears the birthday party, and then we cut to the archival footage. And I just thought it was such an interesting way of kind of representing memory and pastness by using archival footage, when these other clips have chosen to use kind of very stylized, very kind of dreamlike qualities. And just wondered if you could talk about that a bit more.
Sure. So I think one of the reasons that Donna probably chose to use that footage was because it was unreleased footage and she happened to have access to it. So it's like great for fans. It's like a good hook, right? Like you've never seen this like moment before. So it's really great on that level. But I think, you know, like it's a different technique to the other films, but I think you're right in the sense that they all foreground their materiality somehow and their kind of fragmentary nature, whether it's within the treatment happening of the form within the films themselves or their placement. So in the case of Johnny Ghost, it's more the placement, because you get that very jarring kind of, you know, switch between resolutions and all that kind of stuff. For me, I think, I mean, that's kind of one of the most interesting aspects for me, because there's a sense that this moment, this culture is so ephemeral and can't be contained or recuperated. And so foregrounding the fragmentary kind of nature of these traces seems particularly important to any kind of active memorialization. So I've been, that's kind of what got me interested actually in the first place. That quote that, you know, it was a culture that was inherently difficult to hold on to, or to kind of think through or capture or whatever. And so I think that's why film's been so interesting for this moment, because of its form and the way, and because of its materiality, it can kind of foreground that element and that kind of, that haunting sort of nature of being there but not quite there at the same time. And there's so many different ways of doing it, which is what's really exciting, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're all kind of you know, the same kind of aims in terms of presenting that era as something quite kind of ephemeral, the memories around it as something quite kind of quite ephemeral, but are doing this in a completely different way between different versions, different films, and different stories. So I really liked that. Really great analysis.
Thanks, Alexia. Johnny, you were very polite. I feel bad that that you were gazumped just now.
I don't feel bad.
We'll talk about this later, Russ. Yeah, so I've got I mean, this question could go to anybody really, but I'd like to direct it towards Laura and Shelley if possible. Is there like industrial logic that is propelling, you know, the cycle or the type of films that you're talking about forward? Like, I mean, who are they for, and where are they seen, and why?
I think there's a couple of things. I think in terms of kind of broader trends of kind of, you know, harking back to the 80s aesthetic, nostalgia for the 80s, all that kind of all that kind of stuff that we've seen in the wake of Stranger Things, which I think has been, you know, talked about to death. So I don't really want to go down that route anymore. But one of the things that we looked at in the presentation, and Shelley will probably want to speak a little bit more about this, is you know, I think these are very much kind of filmmakers making these films for their mates, for this kind of very this very aware audience. There's lots of kind of in references, lots of intertextuality, lots of kind of cameo appearances, things like that. Filmmakers working across each other's work, and so on, which I think is interesting. Shelley wrote a great bit about this for the paper, so I think probably has more examples off the top of her head than I do, so I might hand over to her.
And I'll be the annoying Randy character and tell you about all the references that are in all the films.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a group of people, like there's people that tend to crop up in these films a lot, like Chase Williamson, Graham Skipper, people like that. And something I think is interesting, you were saying about like exhibition wise, like where are these things sort of screened? There's an interesting kind of tension between one of the things that we're looking at is, well, two of the things that we're looking at are Video Palace, which is a podcast about VHS, and then Dead Wax, which is about the search for these final records that you have to kind of play all at once to get this experience of listening to them.
Which is a short form TV show, we should say, more like a web series, yeah, almost, except that it's hosted on Shudder. Really, I don't even know what how you'd describe it in terms of form anymore. 10-minute episodes. And
they're both sort of screened through or put out through Shudder, which is, you know, like an online digital streaming service.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's an interesting tension between, you know, what these things are doing and what they're talking about and how they're actually being exhibited digitally is an interesting thing that I think we're going to look into more as well.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, in terms of kind of, you know, like industry imperatives and thinking about why these films are made and you know, why they're potentially popular, I guess they're coming from, a lot of the films that we talk about in the presentation are coming from very different markets at very different times as well. Obviously we talk about Ring and the kind of, you know, the popularity particularly in the UK and US of the kind of Japanese techno horror films at the turn of the millennium, and then also, you know, the newer stuff that we're talking about is made in different countries, in different kind of cycles, different kind of approaches. You know, Video Man is kind of more kind of art house film with kind of giallo pretension, I suppose, in some respects. I know it was screened at the festival when it came out, I believe. I think I remember seeing that. And then these other films which are kind of, you know, like low budget American independents, and then there are also these films, podcasts, TV shows, short form TV shows that are being released directly to Shudder, that are Shudder exclusives and are being developed with Shudder. So very clearly intended for very, you know, very small, very niche audiences. So it's interesting really that it's a trend that spreads across those different kind of industry contexts, I think.
I was going to say games as well, like the Puppet Combo games.
Yeah,
have very niche appeal kind of, you know, 8-bit, 16-bit games that look like slasher films from the 80s.
Yeah.
So very, very niche.
Yeah, very much so. So I think, yeah, there's part of a sort of wider culture of nostalgia whereby, you know, some bigger budget, bigger audience things are being made, but it's also clearly kind of, you know, bleeding into other aspects of production as well, which I think is really interesting. It's quite widespread.
Thanks, Laura and Shelley. Well, I think we've got time for at least one more question, if anyone's got a question.
I had one for Johnny, which was, I was just wondering sort of what had happened in the wake of the herd. I mean, obviously you talk about like it had been picked up by various animal rights websites and things like that, and obviously screened at festivals and continues to do so. I'm wondering, really, has there been any more vegan horror? Has the production of the herd and its exhibition kind of instigated any more films or anything else in this kind of area?
I can respond to that. I just want to let you know that you will hear some noise in a moment because my dog is going mental downstairs. All right.
That's okay.
So, I mean, the short answer is yes. There has been a feature length or a sort of a 40 to 50 minute vegan horror film, and I can't remember the name of it. But it was screened at, this is so annoying, but it was screened at a virtual horror film festival, and I'm sure it may have been Celluloid Screams or something like that. But in terms of a similar kind of sort of activist film, which is part of the sort of a broader campaign, no. And I suppose this is one of the issues that you have with sort of small short form horror movies that are trying to make a difference, like The Herd. The extent to which those films do make a difference is ultimately unquantifiable. And if they do make a difference at all, it'll be a very, very small one. And like as I sort of said in the talk in the conclusion, it's important to see The Herd not as the be all and end all, the thing that makes the difference, as it were, because it's futile, because it never will be that. But in the case of The Herd, at least, it's part of a broader conversation about people's changing attitudes towards animals and dietary choices and all of this stuff. And I think that it's credible to argue that The Herd contributed or continues to contribute to that discussion, even if, you know, not many people in the grand scheme of things has seen it. It's part of a debate, you know, with, you know, Blue Planet 2 and cie-𝗁𝗵𝗵𝗀 and all of these other sort of big hitters. So in terms of the direct impact of The Herd, it's really impossible to tell, but it is part of an ongoing conversation, and I think that's undeniable, and that's where the place, as it were, of the film is. And my dog didn't bark once. Can you believe that?
Thanks, Johnny. Right, we have time for one last question. If anyone's got anything they want to ask just before we wrap up, before Johnny's dog goes crazy. Maybe we should spare Johnny's dog, and we might not know what might happen if.
I'm not going to spare my dog.
That sounds well. Anyway, listen, I just want to say thank you very much to all of the speakers for their talks and also for their contributions today. So big thank you to Laura Mee, to 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗀, to Alexia Canas, to Johnny Walker, and to Steve Jones. Thank you all for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure to put the conference together for you all. We hope we can all see you in Ljubljana very soon. Thank you.